The wind came first, sweeping across the high Wyoming plains like a restless ghost, scattering snow against the small wooden cabin tucked at the edge of the pine forest. Wade Carter, age 30, stood on the porch, a tall, broad man wrapped in a dark coat that had seen too many winters. His breath rose in pale clouds as he watched the storm swallow the horizon. Nights like this had a way of unearthing loneliness, and though he never said it aloud, the silence of his cabin sometimes felt like a punishment he deserved. Then came the voice, soft, trembling, and near lost beneath the wind. "Can I sleep in your cabin for one night?" He turned sharply, eyes narrowing through the swirl of snow. At first, he thought it was a trick of the storm, a whisper shaped by the wind. But then she appeared, a slender figure half buried in white, shawl clutched tight around her shoulders, her dark braids frosted with ice. Her cheeks were raw from the cold, her lips cracked, her steps uneven. She looked no older than 20. Wade hesitated. Strangers were trouble, especially in this part of the frontier. A woman alone in such weather, there was always a story behind that. And stories, he'd learned, had a way of burning even the kindest hands. Still, something in her eyes, a quiet dignity wrapped around exhaustion, stilled his doubt. Without another word, he opened the cabin door wider. "Come in," he said, his voice low but steady. The warmth of the fire hit her as she stepped inside, blinking against the sudden light. The cabin was simple: a table, a chair, a narrow bed, and a stack of firewood by the hearth. She stood near the door, hesitant, as though afraid she might bring the storm inside with her. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the chair. "You're frozen through." She obeyed silently, holding her hands close to the fire, shivering until the tremors became tears she couldn't hide. He poured coffee into a tin cup and set it before her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He studied her face, soft features, dark eyes reflecting both pride and weariness. "You got a name?" "Sihu," she said after a pause. "Means flower in my people's tongue." He nodded once, as if the name alone carried a history he wouldn't ask about. Wade Carter. The silence stretched between them like a tightrope. He leaned against the table, his shadow flickering with the firelight. She caught sight of a Bible near his bed and a guitar propped beside it. Her gaze lingered. "You play?" "Used to." "Why'd you stop?" "Some things sound better quiet," he muttered, then realized how strange it must have sounded. She smiled faintly, and for a moment the cabin seemed less lonely. Outside, the storm deepened. The wind clawed at the door. Sihu flinched, her shoulders tensing. Wade noticed. "You runnin' from someone?" Her eyes darted toward the floorboards, the flames reflecting in her lashes. "From people who don't see me as one." He said nothing. The meaning settled between them like falling ash. He'd seen that kind of cruelty before, in words, in silence, in the way a town could turn its back without ever looking. When morning came, the world was buried under white. Wade stepped out to check the horses, and that's when he saw them, 2 sets of tracks in the snow leading to his cabin. One was hers. The other stopped halfway, half erased by wind. Whoever had followed her hadn't come closer. He returned inside, brushing frost from his coat. "Someone was Tylin you." Sihu froze. Then, slowly, she nodded. "They followed me from the town." "Why?" Her fingers tightened around the cup. "They called me names. Said I didn't belong. One of them tried to take my shawl, to see how much of me could be stolen." Her voice cracked but didn't break. "I left before they decided to take more." Wade's jaw clenched. He looked toward the window where the snow drifted like quiet judgment. "No one'll hurt you here." She looked at him for a long time before answering. "You shouldn't say that. Kindness makes men like you enemies of your own." He half smiled, the expression thin but real. "Wouldn't be the first time." That night, he found her strumming his old guitar. The sound was broken, uneven, but she played softly, like one might speak to a wounded thing. When she saw him watching, she stopped, embarrassed. "I didn't mean to." "Go on," he said. She did. The cabin filled with a fragile melody, the kind that reminded Wade of the years before solitude had hardened him. Each note rose like breath in the cold air, lingering, uncertain whether it belonged. He sat down, listening. Somewhere between the chords and the fire's crackle, he felt something inside him shift, a thaw he hadn't known he needed. In town, rumors grew. Wade Carter, the giant cowboy with the quiet eyes, was keeping an Indian girl at his cabin. Some said he'd lost his mind. Others whispered worse. When he rode in for supplies, conversations stopped. The storekeeper refused to meet his gaze. "A man's gotta be careful who he keeps company with," one rancher muttered. Wade looked him in the eye. "A man's company is his own affair. Not when it shames the town," the man spat. Wade's voice stayed calm. "Then maybe it's the town that oughta look in a mirror." He left with his supplies and silence trailing him like dust. When he reached the cabin, Sihu met him at the door, her face bright despite the cold. She'd cleaned, mended his coat, even cooked something that smelled faintly of corn and herbs. "You went to town?" she asked. "Yeah. They hate you now," she said quietly. He shrugged. "They didn't like me much before." Her laughter, soft, tired, but real, filled the small room. She touched his sleeve. "You shouldn't lose peace for me." Wade met her gaze. "Maybe peace wasn't worth much before you walked in." She looked away quickly, her cheeks warming. Outside, snowflakes drifted like slow confessions against the window. The blizzard came that night, stronger than any before. The roof groaned, the fire dimmed, and the cold crept into their bones. Wade fed the flames while Sihu huddled under a blanket, trembling. He sat beside her, their shoulders brushing. "You ever think the snow remembers?" she whispered. "Remembers what?" "The lives it covers." He thought about that for a while. Maybe it remembers the ones who didn't give up. She looked up at him, and in that gaze the walls of fear seemed to fall. Her fingers brushed his hand, hesitant but brave. He didn't pull away. The fire flickered between them, small, fragile, alive. "You shouldn't have helped me," she said. "They'll make sure you pay for it." He shook his head. "I'd rather be hated for kindness than loved for cruelty." Her breath caught. No one had ever said something like that to her. Tears welled in her eyes, and when he reached out to wipe them, his rough fingers trembled. The world outside howled, but inside the cabin, something sacred bloomed. He kissed her forehead gently. "You're safe here," he said. The wind wailed, but neither moved away. When morning came, the storm had passed. The world glittered under a new layer of snow. Wade saddled his horse and turned to her. "We're goin' to town." Her brows knit in worry. They'll see." She didn't ask what he meant. She trusted him now, in the quiet way people trust the ground under their feet. When they rode into town, conversation stopped again, but this time he didn't bow his head. He dismounted, helped Sihu down, and led her toward the church. The preacher looked startled as they entered, boots echoing against wooden floors. "I came to marry her," Wade said simply. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. Someone dropped a tin cup. "You can't marry her," a voice barked. "She's not one of us." Wade turned, his tone steady as a hammer strike. "Then maybe you ain't one of me." The preacher looked between them, her trembling, him unwavering, and opened his Bible with shaking hands. "Love knows no color before the Lord," he said softly. The vows were simple, honest. When Wade slid a small silver ring, once his mother's, onto Sihu's finger, she whispered something in her own tongue, a blessing, a promise. He didn't understand the words but felt their meaning all the same. Outside, snow began to fall again, quiet and slow. When he kissed her, it wasn't defiance, it was belonging. The church bells rang low, and the people, silent, watched something they couldn't quite name. Weeks passed. The snow melted into streams that whispered through the valley. Sihu planted herbs near the cabin window. Wade carved her a wooden comb with clumsy hands. When he gave it to her, she smiled, pressing it to her chest. "This cabin saved me," she said. "No," he replied softly. You saved me from it. The valley bloomed. Birds returned. And though whispers still followed them, they no longer pierced as they once had. Time has a way of dulling hatred, the same way spring softens ice. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Wade played his guitar again. Sihu would sit by the fire, humming softly. The sound drifted out into the forest, rising through pine and sky like a prayer for all the hearts the world had tried to silence. Years later, an older Wade sat on that same porch, snow falling around him in slow, forgiving flakes. The cabin smoke curled upward into a pale sky. Inside, Sihu, hair streaked with silver now, stirred a pot, humming the same tune she'd once played on his guitar. He smiled at the sound. He thought of that night long ago, when she had stood trembling at his door and asked, "Can I sleep in your cabin for one night?" He whispered to himself, voice rough as gravel but warm as the fire inside. For one night, that's all it took to find forever. He watched the snow settle on the steps and turned his gaze toward the horizon, the same endless white where he'd first seen her shape in the storm. Then, as if speaking to whoever might listen beyond the years, he murmured, "Sometimes love doesn't arrive like thunder. It knocks, cold and trembling, in the middle of your loneliest winter. And if you're brave enough to open the door—" He paused, smiling faintly as the wind brushed his cheek. "The rest of your life might walk in wearing snow.